Hello, this video is on the Bible as Literature, Part 3. I'm going to talk about narratives in the Bible. So there on the slide cover, you see a photo of the narrative of Jacob's Ladder. So this is the Bible as Literature, Part 3, Narratives and Stories. Narratives contain the majority of the literature in the Bible. In the previous lesson on poetry, I mentioned that poetry is about 1/3 of the Old Testament, and so it's a very large part. But the single largest part is narratives. Most of Genesis through Esther, uh, maybe the first half of the Old Testament, is narratives. In the New Testament, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. Those are narratives. And parts of the rest of the Bible are also narratives. Most of biblical history is described in narratives, although if you see books of the Bible put into categories, and some are called history books or historical books, they are, but they don't really fit into the modern literary genre that we would call history books. They're a little different. A couple ways that the biblical narratives are different from history is that historical biblical narratives are mostly chronological, but there's more exceptions to that than we would usually find in Western literature. Like Genesis 36 extends far past the end of Genesis in time. Judges 17 to 21, that's the tail end of the book of Judges, that happens actually early in the period of Judges. Daniel, if you put the chapters in chronological order, it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, and then 6 and 9 through 12. It would be somewhat later, but not quite sure how to order those. And the book of Jeremiah has a fair amount of narrative in it too, and it's not chronological at all. I didn't even try to write down the order that it goes in. In the Gospels, chronologies are a topic of discussion. When you try to do a harmony of the Gospels, that can sometimes be a little bit tricky, and part of the reason is the chronology there. Also, in the Bible, the narratives in the Bible contain a lot more direct speech than you'd find in most Western narratives. Like if you read a biography, you wouldn't get nearly so much speech in the biography of the main character as you get, say, from Jesus in the Gospels. You could call the Gospels a biography, maybe, but they're a little bit different. They're kind of in a category by themselves. The prophetic books in the Bible have narratives, but oracles in the prophetic books are, what the prophet says or what God says through the prophets. That's what really makes up most of the books. And this is, while it's not normal for modern literature, it is similar to some other ancient literature like Homer and Thucydides. If you read, Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and if you go back and read those, there's long speeches in those books too. So the Bible actually fits a little bit into the way narratives were done in ancient literature. Now, also, biblical historical narratives are selective in a way that's not like modern history books. There are many examples. I'll just give you a few. Driving historians crazy, you would have the fact that the book of Exodus, chapter 1, names the Hebrew midwives, but it doesn't name Pharaoh. And we would sure like to know which Pharaoh it was. That would help us, put the Exodus in the right chronology and history, and everybody might agree, or maybe they might even argue more, but the Bible just doesn't name the Pharaoh. There was an enormous earthquake. They've got archaeological evidence on it. It was estimated to be about 8 on the Richter scale, so really huge, the biggest one in known history in the land of Israel. And that happened during the reign of Uzziah. But in the primary history of Kings and also in Chronicles, the earthquake isn't mentioned. It's referred back to in the book of Amos, which says that Amos was writing 2 years after the earthquake. And the earthquake was apparently such a big deal that it's mentioned in Zechariah, and people remembering it. But that was 200 years in between the earthquake and when Zechariah was written. So it was a really big deal, but the primary histories of the Bible, they didn't mention it. Another thing is the Ark of the Covenant was originally at Shiloh, and apparently Shiloh was destroyed. That may have happened during the time of First Samuel when the Philistines won a victory, a major victory over Israel, but it doesn't describe Shiloh being destroyed, but apparently it was completely destroyed. And the Bible says it was, but in the primary history account there in First Samuel, it doesn't mention it. And yet, ordinary stories like Ruth are included. If you look at the book of Ruth, there's no miracles, no kings, no battles, no great historical events. The only thing that connects it to a major event at all is that it turns out Ruth, in the last few verses of the book, she's the great grandmother of King David. Now, the most significant thing about narratives in the Bible, and the thing that I wanted to talk about most, was stories. And that's that if you had to describe biblical narratives, the one thing that characterizes them more than anything else is that they consist of a series of stories. History outside the Bible is not usually taught that way. If you had a history class in school, you almost surely didn't get it taught as a whole series of stories. And yet, if you start to think about it, maybe the way the Bible did it might be a little bit better. You know, I can't even count the number of people who told me that they had complaints about history or they didn't like it so much in school because they just couldn't remember all those dates and battles and stuff. You know, the Bible has dates and it has battles too, but it's primarily taught as a series of stories. And I think people, if we taught history like that, they might remember it a little bit better. Uh, I say an advantage is it's more memorable. Of course, Jesus told lots of stories too, so maybe that tells you something. Stories are also understandable at all ages. Bible stories can be told to little children who can learn lessons from the stories. The stories are more teachable. In a church service, you might have a preacher preach on one story 1 week, and if you're preaching expositionally through a book, you know, you can say, this week we'll talk on the story of Jesus and the widow who only gave 2 mites, and then last week it would be the story of Jesus talking to the Sadducees and that sort of thing. So often, as a preacher or as a teacher, you can break your lesson up into one story after another. Also, in the Bible, there are cases when even the order of the stories can give a message. I won't really go into examples of that here, but the book of Mark is a good example where the stories of what Jesus did are often arranged in such a group that the sequence and the group together tells you a message. Okay, stories and repetition. One feature of poetry that we mentioned is that there's a lot of parallelism in biblical Hebrew poetry. Often a line will say one thing, and then the next line will say it in sort of the same way with slightly different words. In the Bible, there's a lot of repetition in stories so that you get one story and then you have another story and you thought, that's a little bit like the previous story is the way it's told. Some common things that get repeated in the Bible is the story of the barren woman, like Sarah, Abraham's wife, and then Rebecca, and then Rachel, and Samson's mother, and Hannah, and then in the New Testament, there's Elizabeth. Of course, all these barren women end up having children. You could broaden the category to include other problematic births like Lot's daughter, Tamar, Moses, who had to be hid as a little baby, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Or there's stories about how to meet girls. You meet girls at a well in the Bible, like Abraham's servant who is looking for a bride for Isaac. Jacob meets his wife Rachel at a well. Moses meets his wife at a well. and Jesus meets the woman at the well. Or how about the story of my wife is my sister? Let's see if we can con people with that one. It happens 3 times, and there really are pretty different stories if you look at them overall, but they have this incredible common element of each time the husband says the wife is his sister. Abram and Pharaoh, Abram and Abimelech, and then Isaac and Abimelech. Or the really strange stories about pulling the wool over somebody's eyes. Jacob deceived his father Isaac into thinking he was Esau. And the explanation is that Isaac had gone practically blind, but it's still sort of incredible that Jacob pulled that off. And also, it was evil. But then Laban turns the table on Jacob. Laban didn't know what Jacob had done, but he manages to trick Jacob into marrying the wrong sister. He ends up marrying Leah when he meant to marry Rachel. So, 2 rather incredible examples of somebody getting tricked. Their drunk dad, Noah and Lot. The king has a dream, Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar. Also, if you do other dreams, you've got Joseph and the butcher and the baker in prison. Here's a weird one that you might not think of. How about the woman kills the commander of an army? That's Jael in the book of Judges, who killed Sisera, the commander of the Midianite army. And then you've got, no, not the Midianite. Yeah. And then you've got the woman and Abimelech, who was the son of Gideon, who killed him by tossing something down off a tower and hitting him on the head. And then Sheba, son of Bichri, was a guy who rebelled against David and took his men into a walled city. And Joab, the commander of David's army, came up to the city and was about to destroy it. And a woman says, "Why are you going to do this?" And Joab says, "We don't want to destroy the whole city, but this guy Sheba is in there." And the woman says, "I'll throw his head over the wall." And they do. And that's the end of that. So, woman kills the commander. Stories and common themes. In the Bible, you have examples where a book is trying to teach a theme or a lesson. And so all the stories kind of include things about that theme. Like in the book of Daniel, you've got the first 6 of these are all a chapter on its own: the unclean food of the king's dream, fiery furnace, the king's madness, the handwriting on the wall, Daniel in the lion's den, and then there's 6 chapters of Daniel's visions. But what they have in common is that there's 2 themes that get repeated. Every chapter really repeats the idea in some way of teaching the sovereignty of God over the kingdoms of men. In this case, these would be pagan Gentile kingdoms, but it really is teaching over all the kingdoms of men. That's the message, like in every chapter in Daniel, including in the stories. And then also, as far as the character of Daniel and his friends, there's the message about being faithful to God while living in a pagan kingdom. The message is, you can do it. Here's an example of how to do it. In the book of Genesis, the stories have a theme of covenant promise, God's covenant promise to men about various things. Starts with the covenant that God makes with Noah and his sons. Really, that's probably not even the first one, but there's that one. The call of Abram in Genesis 12 has a promise and a covenant that God makes with Abram. And then God reiterates it after Abram separates from Lot. Oh, then there's the covenant of the parts that God makes with Abram, the covenant of circumcision, the promise to Hagar when Ishmael is born. Then there's the promise to Abraham and Sarah of Isaac. And then that second one the promise to Isaac, that happens later on, because before God promises to Isaac that the covenant will go to him too, you have the binding of Isaac where he's almost sacrificed when he was a youth. And then there's Jacob's ladder where God repeats the covenant promise to Jacob. So that's a theme in Genesis, and it comes up in almost all those stories. And then here's an interesting question. In a way, the Bible is sort of just telling you one story. Let me show you kind of what I mean. God takes the initiative in the Bible. People are used to thinking sometimes of religion as a thing, of an example where men are reaching up to God, but the Bible completely reverses it. God is the one who takes the initiative. He reaches down to save Noah. He calls Abraham. He rescues Lot. Moses really gets drafted. He didn't want to do his job. The Lord has to talk him into it. And God reaches out to bring Israel out of Egypt. God calls all the judges, all the saving acts that happen in the Bible are a result of God taking the initiative, not men. And what the stories tell, the prophets also will say. The prophet will say the same thing the stories tell. Isaiah 59:16 says, speaking about God, he saw that there was no man and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. Now, see, I didn't even mention Jesus on this page, but the point is, all these stories, in a way, are all pointing to Jesus. Or how about the Redeemer? The Redeemer comes from Bethlehem. Boaz and Ruth. Boaz is the first big example in the Bible we have of the kinsman redeemer. Ruth is the individual who needs to be redeemed. Boaz comes from Bethlehem. He takes a bride from the nations, not from Israel, the nations. The Redeemer comes from Bethlehem. In the story of David and Goliath, the Redeemer is sent by his father. He's rejected by his brothers. Do you remember in that story how his brothers were tacky to him when David shows up? And then David saves the people. And the prophet says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days." So the prophet is saying the same thing that the stories say. Or how about the son comes from Egypt? God brings Israel out of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea and they're 40 years in the wilderness. God brings Jesus out of Egypt. He is baptized, so you have a water thing there, and then 40 days in the wilderness. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That's what Hosea writes, and that's God speaking, and it's talking about Israel, right? Well, it is talking about Israel, but then in Matthew 2, Matthew quotes this, and it fulfills what the prophet says, out of Egypt I called my son, pointing also to Jesus. Or how about this story? The father sacrifices his son. One of the most difficult stories in the Bible to even discuss is the story in Genesis 22, where God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac to the land of Moriah and sacrifice him. Moriah is what was the name in that time, what it was today, Jerusalem. The father has to take his son to Jerusalem to sacrifice him. And what is this talking about? Well, in Genesis 22, God speaks to Abraham and says, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love." Well, it's a stretch to say only son because Abraham has two sons. But the command is to take his only son to, to the land of Moriah. The son carries the wood on his back for his own sacrifice. You know, when the author wrote the book of Genesis, only God knew that he was writing about Jesus Christ. He could not have known that Isaac carrying the wood on his back was a picture of Christ carrying the wood up the hill for his own sacrifice. Abraham says, when Isaac asks him, "I see the wood and the fire, but where is the sacrifice?" And Abraham says, "God will provide the lamb." And Abraham says this prophetically, and he's talking about Jesus Christ. he doesn't, if you read the story, God actually doesn't provide a lamb in Genesis 22. He provides a ram with a R, rhymes with lamb in English, but when Abraham says God will provide the lamb, he's speaking really prophetically about Jesus Christ. So sometimes these repeated stories are such that the person controlling the repetition is the author of all scripture, um, the Lord God himself, not just the human author who was writing down the story. So that's what I wanted to say about narratives in the Bible. I hope you enjoyed it. I've got to do another topic on narratives because it's a really big topic, but I wanted to talk a little bit about narratives and stories in this one. So I'll come back hopefully soon and have another presentation on biblical narratives.